Hello. It's a little over 3 years from the day I started developing Sulphur Memories Alchemist, so I decided that a retrospective video is in order. I welcome you on this journey down memory lane with me. But before we talk about the past, let me briefly mention the present. As of right now, Sulphur Memories Alchemist is upcoming on Steam. I would appreciate if you visited the page and perhaps even wishlisted the game. The link is in the description. Now, let me start from the very beginning. Alchemist was born out of two unrelated concepts that stuck with me since my university days. The first was an idea without a game, of an alchemist traveling an open world, collecting various components and mixing them into potions. The recipes would be random, you would have to learn them by experimenting, and the ultimate goal would be to create the Elixir of Life, while all the other potions would help you overcome the challenges. While it sounds a lot like what I ended up with, the idea was extremely raw. The fact that it was about 10 years ago is a testament to how far a cool idea is from an actual functioning game. The second concept was of a dungeon generator that I implemented for a university project. My friend and I created a little ASCII roguelike in pure C++, where you would descend through the dungeon filled with undead and fight the Lich at the end. The game wasn't what I would call complex. The only thing you could do was move or attack, and the only strategy would be to beeline towards the stairs while avoiding the enemies as much as possible, so that you had enough health to take down the Lich. I wish I could show you the game, but its source code is lost to time. The dungeon generation algorithm, my part of the project, was simplistic, but the results turned out interesting. The core idea was as follows. You pick the coordinates for the start, you make a room around that point, ensuring it doesn't collide with anything. You choose a wall in the room and build a hallway. At the end of the hallway, you try to make another room. If it doesn't fit, remove the hallway and try again. If it fits, repeat the process, choosing the wall from either of the rooms. Continue like that until you reach a certain number of rooms. Then place the upward stairs in the first room and the downward stairs in the last one. I am of course skipping a lot of implementation details here. The point is, I liked the algorithm, and in the following years I made several attempts to re-implement it for a different engine. Which is precisely what happened in April 2020. In 2020, during the infamous calamity, I was one of the people who suddenly found themselves with an excess of free time. At the time, I had a lot of programming experience, but only a basic understanding of game design. I enjoyed making small projects for myself, but I never had any intent of releasing them to the public. They rarely went beyond very basic prototypes, and even for those that did, I never had great ambitions to begin with. That was the case for this one as well. I made a Love 2D project simply called Dungeon, with the only purpose of generating a dungeon and rendering it on the screen. Unfortunately, it was so insignificant in my eyes at the time that I didn't even bother making a repository, which is why I can't show you the project at its earliest stages. What you're seeing on the screen right now is from a slightly later version, from early May. It comes as no surprise that I wasn't very motivated at the time. There was a prolonged period when my code didn't produce anything interesting, and I was very close to dropping the project completely. It changed when I finally got the first complete dungeons. Just hallways and walls, yet still it made me want to try for myself what it's like to explore them. I decided to place a character into the dungeon. Who would it be though? At that moment, I didn't yet know that I'm deciding the future of my game. That was when I recalled the Alchemist idea. I picked a placeholder tile from the Unbound tile set and dropped it into my dungeon. I coded in some simple movement logic, line of sight, and voila, I'm exploring the dungeon. A very empty dungeon, but still. It was enough to reignite my interest. From now on, the project folder was proudly labeled Alchemist, even if there was no alchemy in it yet. I grabbed a few Creative Commons assets, like torches and ivy, to decorate the dungeon, and included them into my generator. Coded in the ability to interact with objects or break them, to throw fireballs that would destroy walls. You don't need to tell me, those fireballs look terrible. I was aware of it even back then. Finally, I added the ability to move between levels. It still wasn't a proper game, by a long shot, but it was something to poke at and see the reaction, which is markedly more fun than just a dungeon. That was when I uploaded my first video, just showing some gameplay footage with no commentary. Seeing this now, I'm amazed at how recognizable this early prototype is. You can't do much here. Break a couple of walls, open or close doors, ignite some torches, and the whole game world is just 2 areas. Yet so many pieces are already in place. Today, I am unsure how exactly I decided on the next stage of development then. But in hindsight, I'm glad I made this decision. The game lacked so many features. And yet, against all common sense, I decided to make a lighting shader. That's something you're supposed to do last, but this feature was what ultimately made me go on. I spent some hours researching GLSL, which was at the time a new subject for me, read up on lighting shaders, and made my own with surprisingly little pain. It was at this moment that the game came alive for me. Instead of boring flat colors, now I had dark, threatening dungeons and warm light of the flickering torches. Even the fireballs were no longer as bad when accompanied by a bright flash of light. The project became something that I wanted to keep working on, and so I did. With my newfound motivation, I started implementing what would become the core of the gameplay, crafting system. At this point, I already decided that it would be a game about alchemy, though I only had very basic ideas about either the plot or the mechanics. I did, however, form a concrete idea of how the alchemy itself would work. Those of you who played the game should already know it fairly well. Instead of using specific components for my recipes, I imagined using some abstractions. For example, if some recipe required fuel, you could throw in anything that burns, and if it required some herbs, you could throw in anything verdant. This way, I would be free to add various flavor items into the game, without worrying about fitting each individual one into the recipes. Originally, I thought the player would have to choose which raw component to add at every step of the crafting, but I couldn't figure out a UI for that which wouldn't be confusing. So I settled on a separate refinement process that would convert, say, broken wood into something to burn. There would be 3 options: to keep the raw components whole, to grind them in a mortar, and to distill them in an alembic, each one producing different results which introduce some strategic decisions. The naming pattern for the components, something X, was inspired by the map markers in Sunless Skies of all things. I liked the implied mystery and the level of abstraction those names gave the recipes. Another important design decision was that every item you find would in some way have to be useful in your crafting. Bent nails can be reduced to something metallic, old wine can be used as something spirituous, dried sap can become something volatile. This concept of no useless loot was something that stuck with me since playing Prey. In that game, it was such a great and reliable way to make the players explore, because anything the player would find would feel rewarding. That all said, before crafting, I would need to design the inventory and some actual items to pick up. I stumbled upon GameIcons.net while looking for assets, and immediately decided that those icons would be a perfect fit. While understanding that I would be far from the only one using the site, at that point I had more important things to worry about. I decided to go for a grid-style inventory, and not to limit the number of items carried in any way. Inventory limits are an interesting topic, and I'd really like to talk about them sometime, but in short, I hate them almost universally. Of course, adding lootable items to the game also meant adding actual places to loot them from. It was too early for proper world design, and for the time I just extended the world a little with the forest area and improved my dungeon generator to be able to produce different kinds of rooms. At the moment, that just meant wine cellars with barrels full of wine that you could also break for wood. Meanwhile, in the dark forested area you would find fireflies and amber. Interestingly, those 3 areas you see, the crossroads, the ruin entrance and the forest, aren't procedural. They were converted from ASCII representations. That was an idea that I was considering, but nowadays dropped almost entirely, though I still use it for some structures. After inventory, the time had come to implement crafting. I decided that you'd perform it on crafting stations, so as not to clutter the UI most of the time. And there would be a station for refinement, and then 2 separate stations to brew potions and make tools. Here they are, standing in the open at the crossroads. I made up a few simple recipes. Fireball Potion, Shockwave Potion, Rift Potion, Clairvoyance Potion. While still in the game, most of them are unrecognizable now. For example, as there was no in-game time tracking yet, I could not make any potions with temporary effects, so the Potion of Clairvoyance just revealed the whole map for you. Most components did not exist either, so the recipes were basically placeholder. And that was also when I turned the instant fireball effect from before into a proper potion throw, using an item from your inventory with this spinning button animation. On the 1st of July 2020, I posted a video of my update and got a surprisingly positive reaction, despite my overall lack of editing skills and the very early stage of the project. If you're one of the people that supported me back then, I send you my special thanks. I cannot stress how important the previous stage was for the whole project, and yet the game was still far from even playable at that point. For one, the game didn't count the turns yet, so it couldn't have any temporary status effects or dynamic environment like fire, not to mention creatures besides the player. Compared to that, the day-night cycle is pretty much irrelevant, but it was easy to implement, so it became the first thing affected by the player taking turns. I coupled up a waiting interface, and enjoyed the brightness changing, and fireflies hiding during the day, then appearing again at night. The next, now possible thing, was fire. A fireball would now cause barrels and broken wood to ignite, turning into flames. Those flames would then burn for a few turns, potentially spreading. I'm not ashamed to admit that I got the idea from Rogue, where a single shot of a fire staff could cause a great amount of destruction from the spreading flames. Now, here is an area that few people have ever seen. It's a mountain with a small cave. The reason I created it was so I had a place where we'd find glacial water. And the only reason I made glacial water is so there is a component for the Rime potion, which would douse the fires. Nowadays, this area isn't in the game, but maybe one day I'll make something out of it. The fire at that point would not affect the player. There is no health, and there isn't yet such a thing as status effects. But that would change soon. Obviously, I wanted my game to have some potential danger, which meant it was the time to start tracking the player's hit points. Some might ask why the health bar is cyan and not more traditional red or green. This mostly has to do with my perception of color, that led to me preferring shades of blue in my designs. This was the point when it first became possible to die in my game, and I even made a simple game over screen. Status effects came next: burning, freezing, shock. The only source of them would be your own potions or the fires you started, and the only target would be yourself. For now. In August 2020, I took a step away from the game's core functionality and instead decided to expand the world. That's how the forest came to be, the first area whose looks honestly made me proud. My goal with the forest was to have a natural environment with a man-made passage through it, so the player would have both a chance to explore and an obvious path to the goal. This forest is my first time using what would soon become my favorite Prologue tool, Simplex Noise. To explain briefly, Simplex Noise is a kind of noise that produces natural looking patterns, which makes it perfect to simulate things like elevation, density of vegetation, ore veins, etc. For this area, I take the noise pattern, then carve a path through it, then smooth out the values, and use the result to define trees, tall grass, and empty cells. This makes a dense but not impenetrable wood with what seems like a path passing through. It's an interesting method that I'm using for quite a few environments in the game, and I might make a video with a detailed explanation someday. Of course, there is also a number of new objects in the forest, including flammable tall grass. Unlike the broken piles of wood, which would normally be in small clusters, the tall grass allowed the player to produce massive forest fires, which at this point in development might very well have been the most exciting activity in the game. And I'm not shy about that, because I know that for many players years later, it still is. Generally speaking, I will not be listing all the items that are kept into the game. Just be aware that alongside every update, there will always be a few. In the case of the forest, those would be the new plant components, foxglove flowers and spearmint leaves. It's surprising how little effort it took to add the creatures to the game. Most of what I implemented for the player worked for them out of the box. They would move, they would attack, they would take damage and receive status effects just like the player. There were some complications with their AI, in one case left unnoticed for months, but other than that, they were fine. My first creation was this adorable mouse. It would normally try to stay away from other creatures, and upon taking damage, run away from the threat. This is where I have to mention Rogue Basin and its amazing tutorial on the extras maps that made it all so easy to implement for me. The next were the snakes. Oh, the snakes. Fan favorite since the very beginning. My philosophy, when it comes to enemy design, is that enemies should be deadly when approaching them blindly, but there should be a reliable counter strategy. The reason is, even back then I already decided that the outcome of the fight should not be determined by the player's stats, but rather by strategy and preparation. In the case of snakes, the danger comes from their poison, that stacks with every bite, but can only kill you if you let them bite you repeatedly. Plus, the snake doesn't actively chase you. The strategy is thus to keep your distance and only fight snakes if you have an antidote to cure the poison after the fight. The problem is that sometimes the random movements of the snake would make it seem like it's actively trying to kill you. I am not sorry for that, but 2 years later I still nerfed them. Bats too reflect my philosophy. They are faster than you, and they do, in fact, actively chase you and try to kill you, but building a light source makes them flee. By the way, here is a secret technique. It's in the game to this day, and I have no plans of doing anything about it. I think it's fun. With the enemies finally in the game, I let myself have some more fun inventing new items to fight them, like antidote potions to cure snake's poison, or noxious potions to create poisonous clouds. It was the first time the game had a semblance of challenge, and that honestly felt great. I also finally realized that poking every tree blindly, without knowing if there is or isn't loot to be taken, is becoming frustrating, and added a toggle overlay showing the items. In the autumn of 2020, I was fully convinced that my little project was going somewhere. I've never had a project take as much of my time and attention before as this one, and at that moment it was already looking like something you could actually play. Of course, there wasn't any actual goal, but there was stuff you could do. Harvest components, fight enemies to get further into the area, gather more components there, burn a forest perhaps. I decided to make a demo release, let people try it out. There were quite a few things I had to do before the release though. I replaced the fireball effect with a better one that I wouldn't be embarrassed of. I took out all the placeholder tiles from one band and created new ones myself. Originally, I thought they were distributed under the Creative Commons license, but I suppose I read it wrong. I added some eye candy, like soft borders to the field of vision and animated targeting cursors, then a basic config menu, rudimentary mouse controls, and a simple tutorial section. In this tutorial, the game explained the controls to the players via pop-up messages, and directed them to find a torch and open the secret passage to the lab, which would reveal itself when you approach it with the torch in your hands. A lot has changed since then, but this section remains part of the game, though altered greatly. I have released my little demo for free at itch.io. It attracted some curiosity, but no great interest. People were seeing my project as having potential, less so as genuinely good, which wasn't surprising. All there was in the game at this point was one dungeon, one forest, and a lab. There weren't yet any other areas, character progression, the story, the main menu, or even the saves, of which I was very aware. That said, my main focus in late 2020 was more eye candy, specifically tiling. To those who don't know the term, I mean how different textures blend naturally, instead of having an awkward sharp border. Normally, it's done by drawing several variations of the borders, but I'm not an artist, I'm a programmer. So instead of drawing, I made a shader that would do it for me. And just like that, gone was the uncanniness of the perfectly rectangular walls and roads. The next big idea I had was to improve the inventory UI. Originally, I was perfectly happy with black and white icons, but my friend convinced me that color would make it better. While I agreed to try, all I knew was that I didn't want flat colors. That would only make my UI look even more amateurish than it already was. I also didn't want the colors to be too saturated, as that would clash with the rest of my design. I struggled for weeks, trying out different ways to color them. Most of the results looked as if some terrible painter had splashed a lot of random paints onto my screen. Until one day, my code produced those ethereal, watercolor-like shades. The basic idea for this shader is that the closer to the border, the more intense the color, while the hue depends on the angle relative to the middle of the icon. People loved it, and so did I. And by now, I am sure this shader has become an inseparable part of the game's aesthetic. Having satisfied my interested, I got to work on the game's saves and main menu. Saving was surprisingly easy, as I was already serializing all the levels besides the one currently active. All I had to do was to write them into a JSON file on exit and read it on startup. It was only later that I noticed how the reading and writing time grew with the game world expanding, and had to switch from JSON to binary. The main menu though was a different story. From what you've seen so far, you can probably guess that UI design wasn't my strength at the time. I was learning it as I went on. Moreover, as I'm not an artist, I could not rely on great art to carry my menu, and I had to code some great effects instead. I tried many things, including Cellular Automata, but in the end I decided that simplicity was the way. I downloaded a font with various alchemical symbols, and set them up to spawn randomly on the screen, floating upwards and slowly fading. Then I found this public domain photo, edited it somewhat, and set up a lighting shader, similar to the one I already made, to create an illusion of floating symbols illuminating the table. That was when I contacted Ricardo, the would-be composer for the project. He had noticed my project some time before, and suggested that he'd write some music, but back then it had been way too early of a state to think of adding music to the project yet. Now though, I had a specific request in mind. I sent him a clip of the menu and asked him to write the music for it. And oh boy, did he deliver. The music he made for me is the one you hear right now, in the background. He didn't stop there either. Without even me asking, he wrote the music for the Tavern and for the Wilderness, and provided many sound effects. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By February 2021, I already had quite some time to think about the story, even not counting that very old concept from 10 years ago. The way I envisioned it was something like this. You'd start in a prologue, where you'd be running from the Inquisitors. At one point, you'd reach the dead end, where the devil would offer to save you, in exchange for your soul. That would set up the character's goal to get out of the deal, as well as a narrative justification for extra lives. The devil would just save you according to a signed contract. That said, the actual prologue had to wait for 2 more years, and for now I decided to start the game right after the contract is signed, still providing the player with enough context, but delaying the work on the prologue until the game's mechanics are set in stone, so as not to rework it too much. The start of the game remained in essence the same. You find the stashed torches, dispel the illusory wall, and then proceed to the hidden lab. The main new thing is the dialogues, replacing the boring developer messages. I made the dialogue system with classic RPG design in mind, intended to build expansive dialogue trees with a lot of branching and actual in-game changes depending on your choices. While this is not entirely alien to roguelikes, it's far from widespread. At that point, I only had a few dialogues, but later found myself leaning into this system a lot more than anticipated. At this point, the primary source of dialogue in the game is Ricardo, the barkeeper. It's his tavern's cellar that you get into via the secret passage. Ricardo is a very important character for the game. For now, he's only providing some information to the player. For example, how your equipment turned up in the tavern's basement, but it's not long until he takes on a few other responsibilities. He is also my favorite character to write for. You never know if you can truly trust him, but in the end, he is your most reliable ally. He also happened to be the only proper friendly NPC for an unreasonably long time. That was also the time when I started to give the world some character through all the dialogue, NPCs and environments that I was designing. I made a conscious decision at that time not to over-engineer the world, and just go with something simple, cliched even. I didn't want to get overwhelmed by the game's lore, and more importantly, doubted my ability as an amateur to write something truly original and also good. I don't know that much about writing, but I do know that tropes exist because they work. I embrace my unoriginal setting of a feudal kingdom with evil inquisitors, and direct my efforts instead to making a good game out of it. Take a good look at this UI. What do you think of it? I hope you're with me on this one. It looks like shit. Those panels are excessively large and uneven. There is too much unnecessary text, and the icons are still black and white, unlike the inventory. The lock is centered awkwardly, and there is only enough space for 3 lines at most. What can I say? I only really started to grasp the UI design after almost a year. Let's make it better, shall we? Here's what I ended up with, and that's how it remains to this day. A bunch of small colorful icons in one corner, scrolling lock in another. I will not praise myself, but I think it would be fair to say it doesn't look like shit anymore. In the same vein, I finally implemented proper mouse controls. When I called them rudimentary before, I meant that while you could control your character with a mouse, you could only click the neighboring cells to move one step at a time, but couldn't click any farther and pathfinder. As you can see, that was something I addressed here, and even added a representation of the path the character will take. As mentioned before, Redirect didn't stop with the main menu theme. In March 2021, he just dropped a bunch of great sounds and music on me, including my favorite track so far, Wilderness Theme. I was compelled to stop everything I was doing and start integrating them into the game. Sounds were a great addition on their own, but more importantly, they changed my own perspective of the game. Where before I didn't care for the sounds, now the lack of sounds for an action felt wrong. So later, I went on to add more sounds of my own where they were missing. I will not be listing them all, of course, but know that from now on, every update comes with a couple of new sound effects. In April 2021, I was preparing for the next release. The game was starting to shape up in terms of narrative and UX, but there was still very little content. All I had by that time was one forest and one dungeon, with little to no reason to go deep, as there was no reward waiting at the end. That was something I wanted to address first, by creating a unique set piece at the end of each area. For the forest, it would be a patch of herbs. For the ruins, it would be a treasury full of gold, guarded by 2 living armors. Then, I proceeded to extend the world. Originally, I planned for the world to be continuous, and have a fixed structure, with variations only within the levels themselves. But as my ideas took form, I understood that I want the player to visit many separate areas, rather than a few large ones. That meant either generating a giant overworld, a task I knew I wouldn't want to take on, or making a sort of fast travel system and an assortment of unconnected locations that you would travel to, in addition to a hub area of sorts. I rearranged the areas a little, so that only the parts next to the town would be connected directly, and set up the stables that would serve as the point of access to the overworld. This is the travel interface I settled on. The map for the most part is a decoration, but it does represent the world, and as areas are added to the world, they are marked on the map. That said, I still lacked actual areas. I wanted my players to be able to explore the world as much as they like. As such, I decided to allow adding new areas infinitely. There would be a few area types, essentially different level generation presets, with procedural names and descriptions, so as not to be too repetitive. To that end, I loaded some very long lists of names and surnames from Wikipedia, wrote some templates, and designed 4 area types: Herbal Grove, Watcher's Camp, Ruined Mansion, and Ruined Fortress. I didn't go too crazy with those areas, even though I made some distinctions, like those cursed mirrors and illusory walls only appearing in mansions, while trapdoors only appear in fortresses. I also greatly enjoyed making what could be considered the game's first boss monster. The player would get new areas on the map by consulting with Ricardo. He would pick one from the pool, give a procedurally generated story relevant to the area, and mark it on the map. He could even give you a couple of hints about the challenges that would await you at that place. Yet another role Ricardo took on was that of the first merchant in the game. Though as a barkeep he mostly sells food, I also gave him firewood and alcohol, both useful for crafts, and lockpicks, to open the locked doors and chests. Alchemist 002 saw the light of day on the 18th of May 2021. At that point, I still considered the game far from complete, even in basic features. The only possible motivation for the player would be to see all the areas and try out different potions, and the only means of progression was getting more resources, rare ones especially. The release got my game some minor attention, including a few bug reports, requests, and other kinds of feedback. That was great, but the anxiety of knowing that there are bugs in the release version caused me to hurry and make a new small release quickly. That would become my usual release schedule: a large content update, followed by 1 or 2 smaller ones, with bug fixes and quality of life stuff. This update is where I first introduced the quest journal, for the people who might miss important in-game explanations. While it was of limited usefulness with only 2 small quests in the game, I had no doubt that soon it would become vital. Ridirect also brought me another bunch of new sounds, like those very pleasant sounds of bat wings, so of course I had to include those too. Having dealt with the release, I could once again relax and implement something I personally enjoyed. This time, the inspiration struck during my night walk, when I suddenly remembered how human eyes see everything more blue in the darkness, and decided to add this effect to the game. The darker it is, the brighter and bluer everything becomes. The intensity of the effect depends on how well lit the character is, rather than on the global brightness of the area. So for example, wielding a torch would make the surroundings appear a lot darker than they would be otherwise. I've seen quite a few games with realistic graphics do something like that, but I've never seen it in a roguelike before. I haven't done much research, but I might happen to be the first here. Having completed that fun feature, I took some time to extend the journal with the automatic catalog of the components, one of the many requests I've got. The next milestone I set for myself was implementing character progression, but that required quite a few steps before I could even approach it. At that moment, your arsenal of potions, which I have to say had grown quite a lot since I started, was all available for crafting immediately. What I planned was a system of unlocks, split in two parts. The first part would be, so to say, guaranteed recipes that you would learn from various documents. I would then design the later levels with the knowledge that the players at least have access to those recipes, and ensure they never get stuck. The other part would be the recipes you would unlock yourself on some sort of skill tree, using the knowledge you found. Those would provide combat options, alternative solutions to obstacles, and various conveniences. And the knowledge would be obtained from books, notes and schematics that you would find all over the world. The first step would be to redesign the overworld areas. Firstly, I wanted them all to be the kind of places where it would be plausible for you to find some sort of knowledge, so the poacher camp had to go. It wasn't very interesting anyway. Second, I wanted a system of tiers, where every next tier would be built around the usage of whatever you unlock in the previous one. I quickly decided that Mansion and Fortress ruins would fit well into tier 2, both already being quite challenging, while the Herbal Grove could be a tier 1 area. Of course, that was far too few for my taste. I wanted to have 2 tiers for now, with at least 4 area types each. So I went on to design more, starting with the Mage's Ruined House. The story for this area is that the Inquisition made a raid on a house of a supposed magician, and you are hoping to find something they missed. This time I was committed to making it unique and distinct. The area is a ruined house in the middle of the forest. The forest is created using the same technique that I mentioned before, and the house is picked from the many templates, then a layer of noise is applied to refine the magnitude of destruction. Somewhere in the house is a secret passage leading to a hidden stash, which is unlocked via one of the many methods picked randomly. Those include a hidden switch, an illusion, and a keyhole. The challenge, aside from getting there, is to figure out which one it is. I like it because it's almost entirely non-combat, which fits well with the game's theme and helps distinguish it from the hack and slash that is expected from the genre. I included this new area into the pool and started working on the unlockable potions. I wanted to have 4 potions learnable from tier 1 areas, and here is what I settled on. My goal was to have multiple uses for each one, while guaranteeing that having at least those would be enough to beat tier 2 areas. The Essence of Rust allows you to destroy metallic grates, but it can also be used to break locks, damage metal creatures, or destroy metallic objects in general. Potion of the Gecko allows you to climb over pits by sticking to walls. Shockwave Potion shatters crystal and stuns creatures. And Hushing Sands make your footsteps silent. I also introduced the kind of obstacles that you would overcome using those new potions. Rooms overgrown with crystals, grates, bottomless pits, gargoyle statues that shoot fireballs at the sound of footsteps. Finally, I added new items that would teach you one of those 4 recipes at random. While the rest of the potions were still available from the very start, those new ones would only be unlocked after finding the recipes. Having done that, I went on to design more areas. The next on my list was an abandoned farm. The idea was that the farmer experimented with alchemy and something went wrong. To keep some of the mystery beyond the first visit, I decided to pick randomly between one of 3 scenarios and alter the areas accordingly. Either there are clouds of explosive gas in the cellar and scorch marks around the farm, or carnivorous plants in the cellar with the whole farm overgrown, or a monster in the cellar with the farm building relatively untouched. At the end of the area in an abandoned lab, there is always an alchemy book, another item to learn the recipes from. The methods I used for generation are mostly more of the same, except there are now 2 buildings and a field in the area. Also, the cellar is generated using the very same algorithm that started it all. It remains key to the game, not just as an inspiration, but as a tool I can keep on using. The herbal grove didn't change much. I just added a backpack somewhere in the middle of the road, containing a bunch of herbs and herbalist notes, yet another source of recipes. The fourth area, though, is another topic entirely. When I say that it traumatized me, I'm only exaggerating slightly. I decided to make the fourth area a swamp. The excuse for our alchemist to go there is a rumor about a merchant who was stuck somewhere in the marshes and had to leave some of his cargo. How would I make it look like a swamp though? Obviously, I could add some reeds and stuff, but what I really needed was water. And that's where my suffering begins. At first, it went well. I looked up some water shaders and coded something of my own that would simply apply distortion to the picture underneath, simulating the waves. And then I included the noise to make the waves more uneven. It looked surprisingly pleasant, but there was one big problem. The shader didn't differentiate between what's in the water and what's outside. And I, in my infinite wisdom, decided that it would be a good idea to not just draw objects over the water, but instead draw them partially submerged. Seems innocent enough, doesn't it? Problem 1. For a 2D sprite, there is no way to tell which parts of the image should be underwater and which shouldn't be. Solution: create a mask for every sprite that would indicate which parts are submerged and which aren't. Problem 2. If we only apply distortion to the underwater part, it looks disjointed from the overwater part. In case you don't know, that's not how it looks in reality. Solution: indicate the level of submersion on the mask and increase the distortion gradually, then fine-tune the hell out of it until it looks reasonable. Problem 3. Bugs. So many bugs. Doubling the sprites, random glitched pixels appearing seemingly out of nowhere, missing sprite parts. I spent 2 weeks, day after day, just ironing out this shader. To this day, whenever I see water in games, I start feeling anxious. This might be yet another thing that no other roguelike has ever done. At least I haven't seen one yet. But suffering aside, I finally got the swamp. Remember me explaining the technique I used to create the forest? Here is another example of the same method, but this time with 2 noise layers. One for elevation and another one for vegetation. At this point, I finally had all 4 tier 1 areas ready, and could move on to implementing the tier 2. First thing though, I wanted to introduce a mechanic to get them from the players until they have the required potions unlocked. To that end, I created a simple quest for Ricardo, where he would need 4 of each potion. Afterwards, he would provide you with tier 2 area locations in exchange for more potions. Did I mention how much I love writing for Ricardo? Anyway, with that done, I went on to complete the locations. With 2 areas, Fortress and Mansion already done, I only needed 2 more. Since the 2 areas complete so far were both dungeons of sorts, for this one I went with the forest again. Not just any forest, an enchanted one. This time, the story is that a group of inquisitors has attempted to find the supposed witch's lair in the woods, but they all perished. The area is similar to the normal forests, but with some new challenges, like phantasms. Those are very similar in design to snakes. They wander around randomly and only attack you if you are next to them. However, unlike snakes, they are immaterial and can't be hurt. There are also mushrooms that explode when you approach them, unless you muffle your footsteps. And of course, the place is littered with the remains of the Templars. It was during the time I was designing this area that I started to consider what the actual religion of the world I'm creating would be about. I didn't want it to just be Christianity, because in a fantasy world it feels like poor taste. Although I didn't want to make it so different that the whole Inquisition aspect wouldn't make sense, so I went with monotheistic sun worship, which was way too much thought just to decide that the items you find on the Templars' corpses would be the symbols of the sun. The real challenge, and my greatest pride of this location, is the last area. There you encounter a stone circle and an altar. You can then perform a ritual on the altar. There are 7 rituals total, and the goal is to figure out which one it is by reading the writings on the stones. Another non-combat challenge. Now, I really wanted this place to feel like it belongs to a real cult. I wanted specific mentions of the god it's devoted to, requests for specific favors, thematic rituals that would fit it, etc. So, that's exactly how I made it. There are 4 different kinds of gods, and the writings differ between them. Say, a shrine to a wrathful god, which essentially means someone like Zeus or Poseidon, would contain requests to keep the crops from winds and storms, or to cast their lightning on the enemy of the writer. While in a shrine of a wise god, worshippers would ask to give answers to difficult questions. And of course, the ritual also reflects the god's nature in some way, so a kind god wouldn't ask you to sacrifice your blood on the altar. If you perform the ritual correctly, you get a nice reward, and if you do it wrong, you get punished instead. Both rewards and punishments are based on the kind of god you are trying to communicate with. Say, a god of war would summon a bunch of living armors to attack you, and an elemental god would strike you with lightning. Now only one area remained, and I already had some ideas. I had this thought for some time, how it's weird that undead in games are usually treated as fodder enemies, when they have so much potential to be extremely dangerous and scary. Sure, a walking skeleton nowadays is seen as goofy rather than scary. But think about, say, Pirates of the Caribbean. The undead pirates are terrifying, not because they look creepy, but because they are unstoppable, because you can't kill them. That was the kind of undead that I wanted to see in my game, and what better candidate for the role than a Lich. The area I designed was a familial crypt of some noble line, with sarcophagi, burial urns, alcoves and bas-reliefs. On the bottom floor, you meet this individual. If you have ever heard about Liches, you should know what to do, but even if you didn't, you can find his diary on the previous floor, explaining how he managed to perform a ritual to live after death, and mentioning a crystal bird. The Lich is completely invulnerable to your attacks. The only thing you can do is avoid him and try to find the phylactery. While it's a combat challenge of sorts, I feel it's distinct enough to be interesting. As I completed the crypt, I breathed a sigh of relief. The largest part of the work for the next update was done. I had full 8 areas to explore, and was ready to introduce the last big feature. In December 2021, I started my work on the most important feature of them all, character progression. The way I envisioned it was as follows. You would unlock the recipes by expanded knowledge, of which there would be 4 types: practical, academic, ecclesiastic, and occult. You'd obtain said knowledge by reading books you find during your travels. However, I didn't want those books to be abstract. Instead, for better or worse, I decided to tie in the knowledge accumulation with the game lore. So when reading a book, you would get some knowledge and an extract from the text. This also meant that you couldn't read copies of the same book indefinitely. And finally, I wanted the books you find to reflect the place where you find them. For example, you'd find books about religion in a crypt, while on a farm you might find a book about calendar, or some gardening manuals. What that meant was that I had to write a few dozen books, split into a couple hundred lore entries. It was exhausting, but at the same time a fun change from my usual work. That's when I began working on most of the game's lore: Ramesia's history, religious precepts, noble dynasties, alchemical principles, geography, magic. This period from December to January is when my understanding of the game world finally took shape. After writing 200 entries, the rest seemed easy. All I needed was to make an interface for the research, set up the research tree, and include this part in the tutorial section. I also took an opportunity to add a few new items, like this very useful homeward crystal. Another great thing that happened at the time was new dungeon music from Redirect. Not just one piece, but 4 versions to reflect different levels of tension. A very timely addition just before the release. The testing was hell. It had always been tiresome, but now the game had so much more content than before, so checking it all took proportionally more time. I spent 2 weeks in late January to early February replaying the game, looking for crashes, glitches, or balance issues, both on my own and with friends. Still, on the 7th of February 2022, I released 011. The reason to increment the second number was that with this update, the game felt like it was entering an entirely new stage. I had all the core mechanics ready, and all I had to do now was to keep building upon them. Just like the previous time, I spent the following weeks collecting feedback and improving the game accordingly. As always, there were a few bugs despite all the testing, but also some requests that I felt like fulfilling right away. For example, the interface to rebind the keys, resolution settings. Also, I finally got to remaking the inventory UI, that at this point still looked the same as on day 1, and needed updates desperately. With bugs fixed and inner peace achieved, I released the game again on 24th of February 2022. I had no more desire to overturn the game completely, the way I did the last time, so now I could focus more on smaller but still important tasks. I had several goals set for myself. Add weather to the game, include the proper prologue, add some requested quality of life stuff, and overall diversify and expand the content. I spent the early March implementing the dynamic weather system, visual effects, and most importantly sounds for the weather. Every type of weather got its own sounds for the outdoors, in the dungeons, and inside the buildings. Sounds of rain certainly make Ricardo's Tavern feel cozier, especially with the newly added fireplace crackling. And wandering the world is more interesting when accompanied by rain, fog, or blowing winds. The newly written books on geography describe time easy as cold, wet, and foggy place, so it was more than appropriate to have those kinds of weather in the game. I was having fun adding more minor things to the game. New flowers here, a bestiary interface there, more potions and items. As time went on, however, I was seeing more and more feedback with one request: to allow the non-permadeath mode. While for some this might be blasphemy, I never saw permadeath as an important feature for a roguelike. If anything, I consider the term misleading and damaging to the discourse. I much prefer to talk about permanence of consequence, an ability to reverse your decisions. That way, we are talking about every moment of the game, and not just the moment of death. Crucially, this permanence is unaffected by options such as extra lives. As I mentioned before, I was considering the death system as far back as the first drafts of the story. The terms of the contract are, in my eyes, an ideal in-game explanation for the difficulty mode, which is why I decided that the difficulty should be chosen at the moment of signing. However, for this moment to make sense, I need to have the preceding story. I could of course just slap it somewhere at the beginning of the game, but I already decided that I needed that prologue at some point, so why not now? First though, I lacked the necessary tools. I didn't have any cutscenes, and telling everything through dialogue would require jumping through a lot of hoops. I decided on a simple narration screen. Unlike the rest of the game, the narration is told from the perspective of an author. Two authors to be exact, discussing an unfinished book. This lets me include some commentary and meta jokes without the cringe of breaking the fourth wall. Originally, I thought of starting the game in the middle of running away from Inquisitors, but then I figured that it's best to start with the most important part of the game, which is of course alchemy. So instead of an action scene, it all starts in a cozy little house, with a crafting tutorial, before you get captured. I moved all the tutorials into this prologue, and provided some proper set pieces to explain them. A grate you have to destroy by throwing a potion at it, some barrows blocking the way, a secret door that can be opened with a switch. It all culminates in a dialogue with the devil, where he offers to get you out in exchange for your soul. It's an appropriately long dialogue, with a few branches. While it's necessary for the story that the alchemist in the end agrees to the devil's terms, I just couldn't bring myself to force the player here. Refusing this deal feels like something you should be able to do, and so you can. I made sure to be very explicit about the results of such a decision, but still let the player insist and get the well-deserved game over. Less radical decisions involve bargaining on the exact terms of your contract. Here is also where I decided to make a distinction between the paid and the free versions. While the free version would allow you to either play with no extra lives or 3 lives extra, the paid one would also allow you to have unlimited lives. I was kind of worried about people's reaction to this decision, but to my surprise, literally no one had issues with it. Anyway, past this moment, the game continues as before, with the only difference being that the devil can save you from death. Short narration started appearing throughout the game, when you start it, or lose, or the devil saves you. I expected people to replay the game quite a few times, and knowing how those could get stale with repetition, wrote a couple dozen versions of every narration, as well as many unique dialogues with the devil. And when I say unique, I mean it. In this one, for example, you can get him to pay you. And here you can end the game early by being too curious. And now, at long last, my game has its story properly told. For all my appreciation of fragmented storytelling in some games, in my case it was never the intent. Satisfied, I moved on to further enrich the game world. A lot of work I was doing at the time could be summarized with just one word: content, which sadly doesn't convey the many hours it took. So far, the quest journal had been very barren. There were only tutorial quests, plus the one to get potions for Ricardo's friends. There were certainly no side quests so far, and I decided to change that. The quest itself is pretty short, but I went out of my way to give the player opportunities to make choices. It starts at the very first interaction with the lumberjack, where you get a completely different conversation depending on who you present yourself as. While the goal of the quest is simple, just deliver the package, it allows you a lot of freedom. You can open the package, for example. Do it in front of the quest giver and he gets mad at you. Do it twice and he refuses to deal with you anymore. But if you open it somewhere he couldn't see you, you get to check what's inside instead, and then decide what to do with it. Another part where I felt the game was lacking was NPCs. You might notice that so far it was pretty much all Ricardo, though I did add the woodsman for the aforementioned quest. Among other reasons, I wanted to have some merchant besides Ricardo, as there were, at the time, very few things that we could spend money on. I decided on making it a pastor of a small church, who sells off some supplies as well as books, to solve his church's money problem. I enjoyed making the area where we meet him, as it was an opportunity for me to make something aesthetically different. I actually had to look up some floor plans for real-life churches. He is also interesting narratively, as he's technically on the antagonist side. As with the lumberjack, his attitude changes depending on how you present yourself, and there is a lot of flavor dialogue for those who are interested in lore. My players seem to have very different opinions of this man, and I'm happy about that. Though I had added a bunch of various areas in the previous update, I wasn't yet completely satisfied with how they turned out. I didn't have time to add some fine details, and I just went with whatever mostly worked. For example, while I have made the entrances to ruined mansions pretty unique and resemble actual mansions, the entrance to the fortress remained just a single tower-like structure with basically nothing in it. That was one of the things I remade, turning it into a compound of structures with a wall and sometimes another dungeon entrance, just to add a little complexity. Similarly, I didn't like how in Mansion Ruins crystal rooms would just happen. While I had an explanation for them, they clashed with the rest of the ruins aesthetic. The solution I decided on was to separate the ruins into two subtypes, normal and crystalline, and design the rest of the ruin accordingly, with blue torches, cyan moss, crystals blocking the hallways, and a new crystalline enemy. The sounds it makes are those of a water harp, one of the coolest finds I made. Finally, I didn't like how most of the early game areas had vipers as the only enemy. I didn't want the challenge in every area to be mostly about dodging snakes. I added liches to the swamp, which provide a completely different challenge. Unlike vipers, liches are actually trying to bite you, but they can't get out of the water, and they become passive after the bite. Besides that, I remembered some requests and improved the UI a little. Added those cute little icons to the character stats interface, and a new button to highlight creatures, similar to the one highlighting the loot. I only had a few more things planned before the next release, and one of them was to extend the main quest. For this one, I temporarily took away the player's alembic, and made a quest to find the replacement. I wanted it to be another step of progression in the early game, and another opportunity to diversify the player's activities. There are two paths you can take in this quest. One is to make a deal with a traveling merchant, who would accept either money or a few random potions of his choice. As with all other NPCs, this one has a lot of dialogue, as I believe it's important for a character to be more than just a function in a quest. Being a merchant, he also sells some useful items. Importantly though, he isn't going to stay forever, and since you aren't going to have much in the early game, there is a slight time pressure to get either the money or the potions in time. Alternatively, you can ask Ricardo to arrange the delivery of glassblower's tools and make an alembic yourself. It's a much more costly option, and I don't expect anyone to choose it willingly, but it's there as a last resort in case the player runs out of time. I spent the rest of September and early October polishing the game. I extended the research tree, added a lot of new sounds, and spent another 2 weeks testing. Finally, on October 20th, I released Alchemist 021. While this update wasn't as major as 011, I saw many people happy with it, and in my personal opinion, it made the game a lot more pleasant to play. As was to be expected, the next update happened very soon, as I learned of a couple of bugs that I missed. I still completed the features I was playing though, the most important of which was the hotbar. There isn't much to say about the hotbar, except that it was one of those features requested more than once, and I understood well enough that it's inconvenient to dive into the inventory every time you want to use a different potion. Obviously, I made a bunch of other small additions and bug fixes alongside it, and only a month later, 022 was out. What followed was 2 more hasty releases, as I kept finding more bugs to fix, panicking, and packaging the fixes with minor additions like lily pads in the swamp and variations to the herbal grove area. Finally, on December 15th, I released the version 024 and breathed out. For the time being, I was done. Roughly at that time, I got several requests to put my game on Steam. Before, I had not been confident enough to do such a thing, but now that the game was in a decent shape, I started considering it seriously. One of the issues I had was with the name. Alchemist sounded incredibly generic, and I don't believe anyone would notice the game's page between Paulo Coelho's book and every other game with the word Alchemist in its title. I pondered for some time, ultimately deciding on Sulphur Memories Alchemist. Sulphur being a reference to both chemistry and the devil, and memories being the only word that didn't sound awkward. The aforementioned 024 is currently the latest public release. But of course, it's not the end. It's not like I was doing nothing for 6 months. My next goal was to continue the main story, actually getting our character closer to the stated goal of achieving immortality, thus outsmarting the devil. For all his efforts, there hadn't been any real progress before, and that was obviously subject to change. However, first I got distracted implementing pretty particle effects for hits and looting. It was never on my roadmap, but it was a relatively simple task, and it looked fairly nice. In terms of the quest, I had the following planned. First, our character would be looking for a recipe for the Elixir of Youth, a potion that may or may not be a myth. He would obtain that potion in the ruins of an old laboratory, but, and I freely admit that I'm making up an excuse, the potion wouldn't work on him because of the contract's rules. However, he would be able to give it to someone else, which would unlock the next stage of the quest. But first, I needed to complete some preparations. I decided to place the abandoned lab underneath the town sewers, and went on to work on that new area. The most interesting part about this area for me is how it can potentially connect to many separate places, including a passage to the Tavern's kitchen, though the exact ones are picked randomly every game. I also like the aesthetic I achieved here, with all the rusty pipes and mold. The sewers are also pretty challenging, as they are meant to be visited after you have dealt with tier 2 areas already. At the end of the sewers, you would find stairs leading down into the Alchemist lab. There is also a quest that leads the players here, so they don't have to guess where the plot is. The lab contains everything you'd expect, and a ghost who can share his alchemical knowledge with you. I'm simplifying it, of course. Besides that, everything happens as stated before. You make a potion and realize it's not working. But there still might be someone else who could use it. But before this someone could appear, I wanted to have a new way to include NPCs in the game, one that would also contribute to immersion. It made sense that the Tavern would be full of people, and that those people would come and go. I implemented a system like that, allowing a wide potential variety of NPCs to appear under different conditions, which would allow me to easily include as many characters as I'd need. In May 2023, I finally started working on my Steam page. Between writing the descriptions, editing the images and making the trailer, it took me until 20th of May to complete it. And now we reach the present day, when I'm writing the script far out of my comfort zone in terms of length. I hope it was entertaining for you. The Steam page is still open and collecting the wishlists, and I'm planning a release approximately in October. If what you saw appealed to you, you know what to do. See you next time.